The economics of country houses. I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Harwood, I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And we're joined today by Christopher Ridgway, Head Curator at Castle Howard. So, Christopher, thanks very much for joining us. And I wonder if you would be able to start by introducing Castle Howard and your own career in the world of heritage.
Thank you, Clarissa. Yes, Castle Howard is home to the Howard family. It is a splendid Baroque house that was built by Sir John Vanbrugh at the beginning of the 18th century for Charles Howard, the third Earl of Carlisle. It has remained in family ownership ever since, and today it operates both as a private family home but as a major visitor attraction in the UK. So Castle Howard Estate Limited, the company that runs the visitor attraction, is responsible for running the entire estate as well, and we receive something like 300,000 visitors a year. I began work at Castle Howard in about 1983, and I have been there since, and I'm now head curator, so I look after the collections, interpretation, but a good number of other things too. I think the interest of an estate is that it is more than just a house, a splendid piece of architecture. It is more than just wonderful art on the walls. A 9,000-acre estate like Castle Howard is a microcosm, a mini economy in itself.
And how has that mini economy changed? You explained that it was gone from simply being a family home to a family home and a visitor attraction, and it's also a location for filming and the like. But what changes have led to that different form of a country house?
Well, I think Castle Howard would typify the narrative for country houses over the last century or so. I mean, let's go back 100 years, and these places were exclusively private family residences. And England, or the UK, as a small island, is literally stuffed with buildings like this. Over the 20th century, all kinds of pressures contributed to their decline, and that's a well-charted story. I mean, somebody like David Cannadine, for example, in his Decline and Fall of the British Aristocracy, will chronicle that story, particularly from about 1880 onwards. Castle Howard is no different in many respects. On the other hand, a good many houses, if you like, didn't make it. They were sold or relinquished or fell into abandon, disrepair, were pulled down in the course of the 20th century, when attitudes towards country houses changed quite considerably. So for the Howard family, as for those other families that still retain those properties, it was a question, if you like, of soldiering on, but of learning to diversify in a changed world. And I think the real critical moment comes, although there are many critical moments, but I think we'd have to look at what happens immediately after the Second World War, when country houses begin to open their doors to mass tourism. And that's led by places like Longleat and the Marquis of Bath, for example.
In books on this topic, in books about the economics of running a country house, this expression comes up again and again of white elephants. And I'm always interested in understanding how that mindset of a country house becoming a burden, really, how that led to the entrepreneurialism we see in modern owners of country houses.
Well, you're right that country houses began to feel all these kind of financial as well as political pressures from the late 19th century onwards. We can date that. One obvious kind of example of what triggers that is agricultural recession, so that rents and yields from land simply don't go as far as they did before. You are then in an age of increased taxation and less power, if you like, by the aristocracy. So with that comes the strain of running an enormous building. If you think about it, they were built to entertain, and in the 18th century, the life of leisure would be very enjoyable, but actually doing nothing could be rather expensive. And I think the point here is that if any entrepreneurial flair in families becomes subordinated to a life of luxury, then the desire or the impetus to renew capital diminishes. So you actually are starting to drain the piggy bank. And we all know that as years go by, money goes less far. And I think this is what happens very graphically with country houses when, for example, it becomes harder to staff them because many people want to seek employment in towns under different conditions. And there is also something we might touch on later. I mean, a kind of construction time bomb ticking away in old buildings that they are going to require intervention and repair. So these are contributing burdens to running a country house.
So is that sense that the estate, you mentioned the agricultural recession, the estate isn't, if it's all got it, isn't going to be able to fund the house. The life of leisure from the 3% or whatever Jane Austen's writing about aren't going to enable you to do that. What do you then do? How did Castle Howard respond to that?
Well, in a number of ways. I mean, I think the specific moment, I think you can chart to the 1930s when the then young generation of 3 sons and 2 daughters, their parents had died, both of them in the 1930s. So all 5 children were still technically underage. The trustees had begun conversations with them to say, do you really want to keep Castle Howard? Can you afford to keep it going? And also, I think politically, there was a sense in which these places, their day was coming to an end. Do you want all those burdens when you could, in fact, offload the property either by selling it or by leasing it out to other occupants? And it's clear in the conversations in the 30s at Castle Howard that the eldest son, Mark Howard, was probably quite receptive to this idea. But come September 1939, all these conversations are put on hold. The war intervenes. The eldest son dies in Normandy. The youngest son dies in Bomber Command. The middle son, who is fighting in the Far East, returns, unexpectedly inheriting Castle Howard as, by that point, a fire-damaged house after a cataclysmic blaze in 1940. Now, if there is a silver lining to this narrative, and I do qualify that, the middle son, George Howard, was passionate about Castle Howard. Indeed, he had strongly opposed sales of chattels during the war. So he returns and obviously has a time to deliberate on this, but ultimately he wants to retain this as a family home, to make it a going concern. So the school that had been evacuated to Castle Howard during wartime, as was common with many historic houses, he negotiates for them to leave the building by the end of the 1940s. And at the beginning of the 1950s, he moves in with his wife to, first of all, raise his family there. So that's a kind of fairly emphatic statement of repossession as a family home. But then on top of that, I mean, he is aware, how do you make this a going concern? And he's among those vanguard of owners who opened their doors to the public in the 1950s. Now, you could argue that Castle Howard and many houses had always been technically open in the 18th and the 19th century if you rolled up with the right letters of credential, But this idea of mass visitation, bus trips, that sort of thing, is pretty new in the 50s, and I think is one of the ways in which country houses can begin to generate income for their running costs and other things too.
Can I look at how, since the interest is explained, because the traditional way of looking at scholarship of a country house is looking at the art and looking at the architecture, and it's a lovely place to have a look around and so on. How is that scholarship changing these days, and how is the presentation of the house changing?
Well, I think, first of all, country house studies, for want of a better phrase, it goes through various cycles of kind of enthusiasm uptake. It's a little bit slow at the moment. I think there is a feeling that, gosh, has the last word been said on architectural history? Probably not, because all of these places are inexhaustible. But with the rise of new disciplines, I think people realize that there are many different methodologies by which you can understand a country house. And slightly perversely on my part, as a curator, I'm on record as saying I'm actually not interested in another art history PhD on Castle Howard. I would like a really good 1 or 2 economic history PhDs. So this requires quite a sort of specialist aptitude. You've got to have somebody who can read balance sheets, most importantly, historical balance sheets, and follow the money, and then relate that to either the opulent surroundings inside or the manifestation of the wider estate as both a designed and a working landscape. And I think there's much more to be done on that, to interrogate those records.
Well, I hope some of our listeners can offer to chip in on that one. Does looking at it in that wider sense has it affected how you presented Castle Howard to the public?
I think it does. I mean, I think there are other shifts as well. Clearly, I mean, why do people visit historic houses? Why do they come to Castle Howard? Now, to some extent, they are responding to perhaps the marketing images that these places put out. So, for example, one of our strap lines would be something like a place like no other. These are essentially unique venues. But what are you going to tell the people when they arrive there? Clearly, you want to explain the architecture and the art collections, and there's a lot to talk about there. But rather than, if you like, tick box art history, here's a Rembrandt, here's a Rubens, here's a Reynolds, the public evince a really big appetite for more than that. The who, the why, the when, the how much behind all sorts of things. And I think in the last 30 years or so, social histories have come to dominate the narrative. So if you go back to 84, 85, when there was the huge Washington, D.C. Treasure Houses of Britain exhibition, sure, these houses are still treasure houses insofar as they are packed full of wonderful things. But I think the narrative curiosity is far wider now. Who was living there? There's been a huge rise recently in below-stairs history, because clearly the elite family are not the only occupants of this building. So, on very simple terms, how did it function as a household unit has become a form of history. Equally, I think you can look at it, I would say, coming back to how much did it cost to run? Where did the money come from? And of course, whilst we've talked about the agricultural recession, there were opportunities for families to diversify and invest elsewhere, or indeed there would have been families who had significant holdings beyond their rural acres. So you only have to think of a few kind of neighborhoods in London, Belgravia and so on, where perhaps 10 acres of Belgravia will yield you more than several thousand acres of indifferent shire land. So I think all of these things are opening up, as well as different kinds of approaches. So I've chaired a collaborative partnership between a number of houses in Yorkshire and the University of York, which is a research endeavour, basically putting research expertise at the University of York in touch with the great collections in the houses to look at new avenues for inquiry and investigation. And we did a big project some years ago on the role of women in country houses, which had been, obviously overlooked. These had been kind of male-centric places. Au contraire, and that work is still going on. All sorts of other houses are kind of opening up their archives towards some of the female inhabitants.
Is that in terms of the women from the families who are owning them, running the homes, or in terms of the staff?
We would love to know more about the staff, but inevitably there's a less of a written record from the staff. That's not to say there aren't isolated examples, but generally elite families have some sense of their worth or self-importance, whatever you want to say about it, and they record their lives in letters or journals or whatever, and that becomes a very rich seam to mine. And so I think probably I just want to kind of put as a subtext to all of this that you might argue that the most important treasure in any of these treasure houses is not the porcelain or the sculpture or the furniture. It's the archive. It's the paper trail that opens up the way for you.
So thinking about making a going concern of a tourist attraction, if you want, how do you do that? How do you make the most of the history, which is the thing that's unique to the house, rather than anything new you might build?
Well, I think the history is endlessly present, endlessly recyclable. I mean, if you think about it, history is, if you like, the prime commodity in a visitor attraction house. And importantly, unlike the cups of tea or whatever it is you have to buy in to offer your visitors. You don't have to buy the history in. You've got it there. All you need is somebody to investigate it and produce particular narratives that appeal to a broad range of the public. And I think, as I was saying earlier, I think those opportunities are just widening all the time. And the role of women is just one early example. I think people have become more interested in the estate as a working landscape as well as an aesthetic entity. Clearly, in terms of new disciplines and investigations in recent years, there has been, very rightly, the whole uncovering of the global connections with country houses and particularly with the iniquity of slavery. And many properties benefited directly or indeed indirectly from that. And that's only just started to be opened up. And that's a contentious and a difficult history, and it needs to be aired. But there are other difficult histories that surround country houses. So, for example, I wear an alternative hat as an adjunct professor at Maynooth University in Ireland, where there is a centre for the study of historic Irish houses and estates. And the history of the big house, as it is known in Ireland, is fraught with more kind of complexity and tension because it is seen as, if you like, as a colonial representative of oppression and so on. Now, that story has become much more nuanced and kind of interesting than it was, say, 50 years ago. And that is reflected in all sorts of ways in which Ireland is dealing with its own past.
So how far has the house sort of adapted to the change, to being, as well as a home, to being a visitor attraction? How do we see this on the ground?
Well, I think one have to think of that these buildings were constructed or remodeled at various times with their functions in mind. So if you go to the great Swiss-born architect Le Corbusier's famous statement that the house is a machine for living in, if you look at houses, saying, being built in the Victorian era, there's a sharp delineation between, as it were, the servicing areas and apartments and the elite apartments and so on. And that was, as it were, constructed in a way to make life easier and the household run more smoothly. Nowadays, the houses still have those spaces, and in many cases, they've been able to open them up to tell that below stairs story. If you go to somewhere, for example, like Tatton Park in Cheshire, extraordinary range of subterranean basement areas that tells all that alternative story. The great showrooms will always remain the great showrooms because that is where their art is, and you can explain and understand the context for both art and architecture in that setting. But other parts of houses, they will have been repurposed to support the entire economic mission, so that old housekeepers' rooms or whatever, old laundries, become offices for an entirely new cadre of occupants. So if you look at traditionally, you would think of a great broad base of staff supporting a little kind of apex of a pyramid in the elite families, from footmen to maids to all the rest of it. Very few of those roles remain today, but houses now will employ marketing managers and retail managers and food and beverage managers and things like that. So there's still a big employment base in particularly the larger houses that is dealing with multifaceted business in a rural setting.
You've said in some of your writing that it was always a job of hard work, owning and running a country house. It always was from the very beginning, and it obviously still is. But how would you say it's a completely different job now, running a country house and the entrepreneurialism that's required, than it was?
Well, I think in old times, you had those kind of delightful sayings like, "Oh, living, well, we get our servants to do that for us. All the hard work is done by others." And there would be a hierarchy with that, from servants to more important figures, for example, like stewards or factors and so on. I think today, for owners, that actually running an estate is and can be a very fulfilling career choice in itself. And I think, therefore, whilst they still do rely on various professional expertise, whether it's kind of tax, heritage, planning, whatever, a good many estates are tackling it themselves with dynamic and, in many cases, younger owners who've taken on the reins from the previous generation. And it is fulfilling. It is not without its challenges. So, for example, if you take somewhere like Castle Howard today, it employs 100 people full-time. That will double in the season with seasonal and part-time and contract staff. And on top of that, you've got a pool of 200 volunteers. So there's an entire HR department that has to kind of deal with all of that before you even open the doors and things like that. Then you've got, obviously, everything that goes with opening to the public. I mean, not least of all, your kind of compliance issues, which, as we know, is an entire industry in itself. And if you don't comply, then you don't get the certification that allows you to open and all that. So there's this various layers of professionalization and specialization that are really important. Now, I've just been talking about the inside, but let's not forget that, the houses that have retained their land is just as important. Now, that land may still be focused, as it may well have done traditionally, on agriculture and forestry, but most of these estates had or still have property portfolios of one sort or another, excluding those who are fortunate enough to have, very kind of promising urban portfolios. It's mostly rural holdings in rural villages in and around the big house itself. And all of those kind of require attention because, in effect, you are a landlord. So that's another kind of diversification. So I think it's instructive just to look at those roles and then to realize, as I come back to saying earlier, it's an entire mini economy. And each bit actually needs to sit together. I think, for example, that the health of the picture collection, shall we say, in the house, is as important to the well-being of Castle Howard as is the health of the beef herd wandering around in the fields outside. There's an interlocking ecosystem, if you like, at play here, and every bit is important and it needs to fit together. Now, the interesting thing about the bigger estates is that they obviously have more opportunities to diversify, so not all of their eggs are in one basket, and if one area underperforms or is hit badly, you can perhaps make up for it in another area. But it points to the fact, as one owner has said, that really an estate is a business of businesses.
And the ways in which you can make money from the land have changed as well, haven't they? So I'm thinking particularly of environmental markets and the economic model of estates. It's a completely different picture now than it was.
That's a huge game changer, and it's only really just sort of coming upon us. Okay, so you go back. Traditionally, your rent roll would sustain the estate, agriculture would sustain the estate, and those traditional ventures. You add on top of that, in the last sort of 80 years ago, that whole revenue from the tourism operation, and that's not unrelated to the landscape because many people come to visit the gardens and the grounds, so they are really important to be attended to. But now I think land is looked at, I think in two ways. One is very new and one is extremely traditional. So land values, as we know, are skyrocketing everywhere. Never has Mark Twain's aphorism been more true: buy land, they're not making any more of it. And the value there lies obviously in terms of either continued rental or capital receipts from housing development. And many estates are looking at developing portions of their land, either little kind of developments or bigger pieces of land, slightly removed from the main house. And these will be done in close conjunction with the local authority, whether it's part of the local plan or an enabling development mechanism. And we know that there is an acute housing shortage in the UK. For ourselves, it affects directly recruitment and retention. And so what is a local pressure is mirrored on a national scale. Well, that's not to say you can just go and build houses everywhere and anywhere overnight, but where there are choice opportunities that can be done, that clearly, as it were, is an extension of what I would call that traditional model for wealth deriving from land. I think where it is completely new, except I wouldn't say it's that new because I'll qualify it a bit later, is that now there are emerging markets in, if you like, the environmental understanding of landscape. And I think, we talk about country houses, searching for income to keep themselves going. I think we ought to look at them through the lens of capital as well. And capital traditionally would be the broad asset base, the art, the collections and so on, against which you could leverage loans or mortgages or whatever, or sell. I think now we are more attuned to phrases and terms like natural capital, which means there is an audit of the land that looks at things through a different metric, that the land has significant value for its ecological assets.
And is that also a value in the potential for the estate being a recipient of environmental credits and offsetting of nutrients and biodiversity net gain contributions from other schemes and so on, where developers in one form or other are having to pay for environmental improvements elsewhere to offset the impacts of their own projects?
That's right. I mean, this is a new and emerging market. I mean, when I started at Castle Howard 40 years ago, it hadn't really been invented. And to some extent, I think consciousness of the climate emergency, whatever we want to call it, has only grown in recent decades. So the two go hand in hand. And I think the example at Castle Howard, where we have taken 400 acres of marginal land out of agricultural production and signed a deal with the Environment Bank, who will pay a rent on that land for 30 plus years, help the management of it, and that will gradually be rewilded. But then you have, as it were, a resource to go into the credits market for that. And this is pretty new, really. And the area of land in question, interestingly, is called Bog Hall. So that'll give you a clue as to the quality of the land there. It was marginal, so your agricultural yields would be disappointing, not very good, haphazard, inconsistent. To sign up to a 30-plus year deal with a sort of, fixed figure and everything, you know where you are for a start. But there's more to it than that, because for us and for other houses too, and we're not alone in this, I think there's a huge opportunity here in an educational sense to broaden people's understanding of what a country estate is. So I go back to that earlier thing I said. It's not just this splendid building in the middle of the countryside. It is very often, in a complementary relationship with the surrounding landscape. And to understand that actually trying to, as the term goes today, to repair or find a new respect for nature is critical. And I kind of look upon them, if you like, as kind of little small cockpits for planetary survival. Let's look at the water quality, the nutrient quality, the biodiversity net gain. I mean, so this area actually at Castle Howard is, as I say, coming out of agricultural production, hasn't been tilled now for nearly 3 years, and gradually it will revert to a mosaic of wetlands and scrub and wood pasture, and we will see later this year the reintroduction of beavers there, kind of, classical sort of natural engineers of the kind of natural world. Now, that's a terrific story to tell. It's as interesting as what houses have done, talking about their below stairs or their women or whatever. And I think that also points to the fact that country houses are inexhaustible as places for inquiry and understanding. And I can cite other kind of disciplines that are emerging that people are really interested in. And not unrelated to this, I think one of the real kind of points of interest is technology in the country house. Now, a lot of people think, oh, that's a terribly blokish sort of thing. But actually, it isn't. I mean, on the tours that I've seen, how is it powered? How is it lit? And you go from coal to gas to oil to renewables, and that's all slots into the bigger environmental picture today. So you look at estates. I mean, Castle Howard has sort of 2,500 acres of woodland. You could argue that as a house alone, that just about makes it carbon neutral, if you use that calculation. But when you've got 300,000 visitors coming, 99.9% of whom rely on motorized transport, then you realize you've still got a lot of work to do. And I think this is another extremely interesting area. So we've installed not just biomass, but lake source heating. Other houses are looking at different renewables. This is changing the game too. It's no different than if you could go back and say, well, in the 1840s, we discovered this marvelous stuff called gas, which we can pipe through the house and light it, and so on. It's just another stage in the never-ending evolution of houses.
Now, and that's a fascinating way in which the houses, which are hundreds of years old, are evolving and changing and meeting modern needs, I suppose.
You do, and you meet them for a number of reasons. I mean, there's clearly an economic need. I mean, I think There's an environmental need, and I think also a lot of houses, they're keen to look at new technologies and what benefits they can bring. It makes it easier to run, whatever. So I think houses are always responding, if you like, to outside pressures. I mean, country houses have never been these sort of rolled up estates that are immune to the wider world. Geopolitical pressures, macroeconomic pressures, they are always at play somewhere, from the Corn Laws in the middle of the 19th century to the opening up of South American markets at the end of the 19th century, etc. So I think here there is we know a growing march towards more environmental responsibility, however we want to term that. And you can do that in a number of ways. How you fuel and power your house, how you conduct your farming. So are you looking at putting less inputs into the ground, looking at leaving land fallow? Are you looking at, like many houses are, well, we need to put in EV charging points because as time goes by, our visitors are going to come in electrical vehicles. There's all manner of opportunity. So I think that plays back to Clarissa's point, the entrepreneurial opportunities that you have in houses. You need the wherewithal, you need the clarity of vision to do it. You need to make sure that the business case is robust and it will stack up. And knowing that, of course, today's modelling may be different the day after tomorrow.
Definitely will be. Looking at history, country houses have been around for a long time. And we've seen just in the course of this conversation that there's a lot of jobs to do. So how would you sort of sum it up? If you have to balance all of the different jobs there are to do, safeguarding heritage, and you've got to generate income and meet your environmental responsibilities and just generally keep the property alive, how do you strike that balance as a steward today?
Well, I think no one individual can do it alone. So I think the really kind of successful owners assemble a good crew around them, and there are strong teams. You inculcate a sense of this wider estate identity so that, I'm not just ploughing my furrow. Yes, my furrow is very important, whether it's food and beverage, whether it's grounds maintenance, but it's part of this interlinked bigger picture. So I think that's an incredibly important message to get across to your own staff, as well as being of considerable interest to the public. Because I find increasingly the questions I'm asked, there are the usual ones, or when was it built and who's that painting by? But more and more people are saying, how do you keep this place going? And you then break it down and say, well, in this area, we're looking to do this, or that area, we're trying to do that. And, we're still facing the big challenges. So restoration will always be looming over you. Old buildings need looking after. And of course, they're all of a particular age. So they tend to have a kind of failure point at the same time. And unfortunately, it's not kind of neatly phased. So there's that. And I think that becomes one of the key messages, both for internally and externally, that we're working hard to keep this place going. We're working hard to keep this place going so that people can still come here and enjoy it, whether it's the masonry on the walls, whether it's the trees in the park, whether it's the water in the fountains. It doesn't matter. It's part of this huge whole.
Christopher, thank you very, very much. Superb explanation of how Castle Howard has kept and keeps going and will in the future.
Yes, thank you so much, Christopher.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.